Closed captioning of this program is made possible by the Fireman's Fund Foundation.
Tonight, gubernatorial candidate Meg Whitman is outrunning her opponents with money and airtime. Are you ready for the new credit card regulations taking effect next week? Encouraging higher education for students from the pulpit to the admissions office. Also, the Art of Shanghai visits San Francisco with an exhibit at the Asian Art Museum. Coming up next. Hello, I'm Belva Davis. Welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me on our news panel, Lisa Vorderbruggen, political columnist for the Contra Costa Times on the political news of the week. Mark Calvi, reporter for the San Francisco Business Times on new credit card regulations. And Nanette Asimov, staff writer for the San Francisco Chronicle on efforts to get underrepresented students into higher education. Lisa Vorderbruggen, Meg Whitman was out in Lafayette for the Commonwealth Club this week. How was she received?
She was warmly received, if not necessarily wildly received. It was a packed house. There's a lot of interest in the governor's race as we get closer and closer to the June election. And of course, you can't turn on the radio without hearing a Meg Whitman ad these days, or an anti-Meg Whitman campaign now that we've been hearing a lot of those ads as well.
Mm-hmm. And television. She's also
and on television too as well. So
she's
yeah,
pretty well controlling her own message, because my understanding is she's not granting interviews to reporters. What is this strategy of ignoring reporters?
Well, you know, it's an interesting one because, you know, at the Commonwealth Club in Lafayette, she granted 3 very short interviews prior to the event. Associated Press got a whole 5 minutes. Whoopee. You know, the rest of us were left standing in the back of the room, you know, against the wall, as we're often corralled in the mainstream media and these events, and given no access to her at all. So, which is sort of an odd thing for someone running for governor, is, you know, coming in. But, you know, we're going to see if it works. She obviously has a lot of high-paid consultants and handlers who feel that if they can somehow control the message and keep her from saying something that gets out of control in the media cycle, then she's going to be better off. I guess we're going to see.
Do they risk voter fatigue, having her face on television so often and all these political ads we're seeing?
Well, so far, you know, you would think we voters in California would be plenty fatigued. You know, we've had so many elections in such a short time. But really, I think the idea is, you know, the advertising mantra is that how many repetitions does it take before you remember something like 72 or some number, I don't remember what it is. And that's really what they're doing, is they're just trying to reinforce these very warm, fuzzy, good feelings about Meg Whitman as this businesswoman who can come in and fix the state.
What about the questions? The Commonwealth Club is known for questions from its audience. So were there any hard-hitting questions coming from there, or with the moderator, or was there one?
There was a moderator, but it was a pretty warm and friendly moderator, and there were really no hard-hitting questions, you know, from the audience at all. You know, the cards get submitted, of course, and there's a short time period, and Meg Whitman gave a presentation before the question started. So we didn't really hear anything new, you know, out of her.
She's not running against anybody, is she?
Well, she's ostensibly running against Jerry Brown, who has yet not to declare, which he will have to do by March 12th. I'm hearing that he's going to very soon, is what we read on the blog. So we'll see what happens when he gets in.
She's got to, I'm sorry, but she's got to get through the primary before she gets to Brown. We're going to step right over her Republican opponent.
Well, there is, you know, Steve Poizner is still in the race. You know, some of her people have been accused of trying to pressure Poizner to get out, and that appears to be the case. He has actually asked the FBI to step in and investigate, you know, the pressure on him to get out of the race. But he has now agreed to 2 different debates between the 2 of them. So, you know, there's no sign on the surface anyway that he is going to be getting out anytime soon.
And what other political maneuvering have we seen this week? You know, I hear Gavin Newsom's filed his statement, and I'm just trying to get my arms around all the.
Oh, you need a big cue card to try to figure it all out. Gavin Newsom, San Francisco mayor, may run for lieutenant governor. He filled out some paperwork paperwork that would let him do that, so he may be in. Dianne Feinstein is out of the governor's race. She's officially said she's not running for governor. Karen Bass, the Speaker of the Assembly, she is going to run for Congress in Diane Watson's old seat, so she's in. So it's just this constant revolving door, these same names.
What would it take for Gavin Newsom to be convinced? He was out in one of the polls as being the most favored candidate. Did he not quite believe that?
Well, interestingly enough, some of the latest indications are that as lieutenant governor, he could be the guy to beat. There's an unknown cast for lieutenant governor at this point on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, we have all the fear, of course, about Abel Maldonado, who was nominated and then unnominated and not confirmed and then re-nominated. So we'll see if he can get enough votes to get into the seat, at least for a few months before the election comes up on the Republican side.
And then what are the chances we're going to see some sort of Massachusetts-style complete turnaround in a state like this, with longtime candidates, Boxer and others?
Well, Boxer is certainly running, like she's got a tough campaign. There's a Republican primary there between Carla Fiorini, Tom Campbell, the former gubernatorial candidates, shifted over to that race, and then Chuck DeVore, who's running, and we're going to see some debates, on that side as well. Certainly, Carla Fiorini has the most money. Tom Campbell has, got a lot of, credibility, but not much money, and Chuck DeVore is, I think, third on the money list there.
I'd call this truly the money year. We've had them before when people with a lot of wealth came in. Track record for people who have a lot of money and come in without any political background or experience.
Well, as we were talking, Al Checky spent $40 million of his own money, which at the time seemed like an astronomical amount. But Meg Whitman is on track and said she's willing to spend $150 million, maybe $200 million. And we have 3 independent expenditure committees who say they're going to raise $20 million apiece to fight Meg Whitman on Brown's side. I mean, the money in the campaigns now is just.
But $20 million doesn't seem like much when you're talking over $100 million. Yeah. So what?
Combined, and of course Jerry Brown will raise money with his own campaign. So the Democrats are very concerned, obviously, that Jerry Brown's not going to be able to raise the kind of money on his own that Meg Whitman's able to pour into her campaign. Steve Poizner is independently wealthy as well. He's already put in quite a few $1 million. So it just really seems to be a case where if you don't have millions and millions of dollars at your disposal some way or another, it's pretty tough to run for governor in the state of California.
Well, we're going to turn now to a reason why we're interested in politicians and who's elected and what they stand for. We're going to turn to Mark Calvi here because we're going to talk about the Congress and what the Congress has done. Well, Congress passed some regulations to really regulate credit card issuers, and we're now beginning to see what that legislation really means to consumers who were quite upset about the way this business was going. So, Mark, what did Congress pass, and what does it mean to us?
Well, it was certainly a popular move to rein in the wild, wild west of credit card lending. And one of the key things that kicks in on Monday is to limit interest rate hikes on existing balances for customers that remain current on their bills. It bans the popular credit card marketing, giving away water bottles and T-shirts on campuses. Students don't need that grief of getting in credit card debt that early. And then it also ends other fees like charging more than your credit limit. It waives that. I should say, with everything I'm saying, there's a huge asterisk because there's fine print that you've got to read and there's exceptions. But those were some of the benefits we got. I don't think people outside the Beltway were stunned to see banks moved aggressively to raise interest rates, kick in annual fees. Wells Fargo last fall, it raised most credit card rates by 3 percentage points. We're seeing B of A testing annual fees of $29 to $99. So banks are getting very creative in adhering to the law, but instituting additional fees.
Is this a kind of a backlash against the consumer because of this law, or is this something that they're going to have to stop doing? Or
I think there's a powerful backlash with the public. They're angry with their bankers. They don't trust their bankers, especially in this credit crunch. They're seeing their rates go through the roof or their credit limits come down. And now they're getting more creative, and I think that's going to spur even more of a backlash. We have banks like Fifth Third Bank in my home state of Ohio charging $19 if you don't use your credit card for a year. Another issuer is charging $1 a month if you want to get a paper bill in the mail. So we're seeing these banks get creative. Citibank is charging 29% and then giving you a refund if you stay current. So you really have to read the fine print. Whether you're a troubled borrower or an excellent borrower, you've got to read the fine print to see how your credit card terms are changing.
So what are consumers going to do as a reaction to this? I know myself and my husband, we have one credit card and we pay it off and we don't play because it's just so scary to try to look at that horrible disclosure thing that's, in 4-point, I could type and understand it even if you could read it.
Absolutely. I think you're the part of an emerging trend. I think more people are going to stick to 1 or 2 credit cards. I think we're going to go back to the past where it was difficult to get a credit card. Dick Kovacevich, former CEO at Wells Fargo, told investors that they only gave credit cards to their current customers, who they know well. And I think you're going to see banks say, how well do we know the customer before we issue a credit card? And from your perspective, we're going to see more people say, I don't need all the grief of having 8 or 10 credit cards. Let's really narrow down the number of cards I'm carrying. I think that's what we're going to see.
And if a consumer doesn't like the kind of whatever the credit card company is doing, can't they just take their business elsewhere?
They're free to take their business elsewhere, and sites like bankrate.com will help you decide where there might be better deals. You could also call your credit card issuer if you wish to maybe try to get a new annual fee waived. Although a cautionary note I have in this environment is be careful of calling your issuer for fear they'll cut your limit or decide, you're riskier than we thought, we're going to up your credit rating, your interest rate. So there's a little bit of a danger in this environment to get on the phone with your banker that they might take some adverse action on you.
Well, I know this was done for the benefit of the consumer, but it just seems to me that you're putting a little fear in the heart of consumers by what was intended as good legislation in the Congress.
Absolutely, and I think we will see some benefits from these limits on raising interest rates on existing balances, but I'd say Congress's work is not done. Small business owners who use cards much like they do a personal card aren't covered with the legislation. They're already looking to expand the law to cover that, and I think as these bankers get more creative, I think there'll be like a cat and mouse game where maybe there's additional legislation pulled in to address that, and there's also a big movement in Capitol Hill to create a national consumer protection agency to help protect consumers when it comes to financial services. Bankers are fighting that tooth and nail, but I think by what we're seeing bankers do, it adds more impetus for that type of an organization.
If you're afraid to call your bank because you're afraid they're going to cut your credit limit, who do you call? Is there a 1-800 help me with my credit card number?
There probably is.
There are consumers union. There's groups that will help you. There's lowcreditcards.com. There's a number of sites that'll help. I would also suggest talking with your banker. Look up at your credit score so you know how you're going to be viewed by a potential when you apply for a credit card. It kind of gives you more information. And I'd actually talk to your banker, get another credit card before you maybe call your own bank and shut down an account. You're going to have a better chance of getting that card if you really don't need it because you have an account open elsewhere.
And when they cut your rate, does that have an impact on your credit rating?
It certainly does because you have less credit available, so it hits your credit score that way, makes you appear more risky. And then if you call those accounts, it makes you appear more risky. So it's a catch-22.
So they get you coming and going.
Yes.
Great.
You picked up on the theme.
I'm
the one
cheered
thing
up,
you have to
Mark.
have, and you really will have to be literate in order to understand at least where this is supposed to go. Which brings us to our next story with Nanette here, and that, of course, is about an effort to make something called Super Sunday work. What is Super Sunday and why is it important?
Well, this is a good news story about higher education, trying to tackle this idea that relatively few African American students were applying and enrolling in California State University. 5 years ago, the university paired with African American churches, and because the idea was go out on a Sunday, talk up California State University, the benefits of college education, where the students you want to come to your university are on Sundays, black churches. They call it Super Sunday because it comes right around on the Super Bowl time, and so this effort is this year expanded to more than 100 churches around California, and it's been steadily rising every year. And what the good news is that evidently it's working, and black student enrollment and applications have been soaring at California State universities.
So this is the way. I think interesting too is the CSU presidents of various campuses who are taking part and seem to be enthusiastic about this.
Yeah, last Sunday, and let me just say that it's all throughout February, so this Sunday you can go to any probably Baptist church, black church in San Francisco, and see CSU presidents, administrators, faculty members taking the pulpit and preaching the benefits of higher ed. So I was last Sunday at Baptist Church in Oakland, where Cal State East Bay President Mo Kayumi took the pulpit and talked up, and the whole idea is to get middle school families understanding that that's when you start preparing for college. So a lot of these children's parents have not been to college. So it's not, so, a lot of people don't understand this complicated procedure of when you have to start preparing, what classes, the sequence that you have to take, and then once you are ready, what you do with it, how you pay, and all that. So there's a lot to learn. And that's what is the message from the pulpit.
So is there any measurement to how this is working? Is it working?
Well, I looked at the rate of applications and enrollment of black students before this event started for the first time in 2005 and after. And before, there was a rise in the number of African American applicants, but it was minimal. There was like a 26% increase in the last prior 5 years with applications, but a 78% increase following that. So you got to say, going to where the parents are and talking to them instead of expecting them to come to you seems to be making a difference.
And there's some program for students this weekend at
yes.
Cal State East Bay.
This is part of a larger effort. It's not just the Super Sunday. So this Saturday at Cal State East Bay in Hayward is a workshop, a real hands-on workshop to teach parents what you need to do to get your kids ready for college and to proceed with this. So everybody go out there at 8 a.m. At Cal State East Bay.
This is such an admirable effort, but I understand CSU is turning away students currently. So I'm wondering, how does this dovetail when these students come to knocking on their door in 5 or 6 years?
It's such a great question because everybody knows that Cal State Cal State University is having money trouble, and they're shaving tens of thousands of students. So it's what Chancellor Reed told me is that it's not a question of reducing, but it's a question of getting more students prepared so that they can at least try.
Well, a really good news story, and my thanks to all of you for joining us here tonight. Well, now some other stories from the news this week. Supporters say that it's the largest river and salmon restoration effort in history. Agreements were made to remove 4 dams by 2020 and determine new ways to share water in the Klamath River Basin in southern Oregon and northern California. If approved, it could end a century-old conflict between farmers, salmon fishermen, and American Indian tribes and the conservation groups over the scarce water in the basin. Governor Schwarzenegger was among those to sign the pact. Well, California's ban on affirmative action in public university admissions is being challenged. A federal lawsuit was filed in San Francisco by a civil rights group on behalf of a group of students. The complaint argues that Proposition 209, approved by voters in 1996, violates the U.S. Constitution's Equal Protection Clause by turning certain students away from UC's most selective campuses. The Metropolitan Transportation Commission now has $70 million of stimulus money to spend throughout 19 transit agencies. That's because BART was denied the federal funding for an extension to the Oakland Airport after failing to meet deadlines to determine whether the projects would negatively impact minorities and the poor. The special bond between San Francisco and Shanghai goes back more than 150 years to when they first became trading partners. Well, today they have an official sister city relationship. During 2010, cultural organizations across San Francisco are celebrating Shanghai as it hosts the World Expo. Well, the cornerstone of this celebration is an exhibit at the Asian Art Museum.
Five rooms of artwork explore Shanghai's cultural history from the mid-19th century to the present. They show how the city grew from a treaty port into a cosmopolitan urban center of nearly 20 million people with a modern, rapidly changing skyline.
Shanghai is so diverse and rich. It's very hard to, using several simple words to describe it. But if I have to, the one word I use is vigor, and the other is dynamic. Right now, what's going on in Shanghai is so much about present and looking forward. People tend to forget about the rich heritage of Shanghai, but actually, beneath the surface, there's a lot of effort to preserve the past.
Zhang Jianjin's installation called Shanghai Garden combines past and present and sets the scene for the exhibit. The artist places modern silicone versions of Taihu rocks, a traditional feature of Chinese parks and gardens, on a terrace made from old Shanghai buildings.
These are buildings that were new in the 20s and 30s. That's all being torn down for something new and different. So the building that he shows in that video, as he's standing there, has now been torn down, and he salvaged the bricks.
Michael Knight is senior curator of Chinese art and lead curator of the Shanghai exhibit. Knight says this blend, this tension between old and new, east and west, has driven Shanghai's growth and inspired artists since 1843, when the British established a settlement along the banks of the Huangpu River.
They built their trading offices, their warehouses, and their residences along that stretch of the river, because that's what they were looking for, was access to the river and to the port. The traders who were the patrons for these paintings wanted a fairly exact look at what they were, where they were. They wanted something to take back home and say, this is where my office is in Shanghai.
As political turmoil and strife raged in other parts of China, the city became a safe haven.
A lot of wealthy people fled into Shanghai as a place of refuge, and they became the patrons for what's called Shanghai School painting, Haipai. The Shanghai School was very different. It was very big, bold brushstrokes, bright colors. So Haipai was actually a term that was applied by the educated elite in other cities, looking at Shanghai and saying, ooh, vulgar, gross, Haipai, bad stuff. Of course, Haipai continues to be much more innovative and becomes much more influential as history progresses.
The changes in art reflect the city's rapidly growing cultural scene and increasing contact with Western art.
And Shanghai has this interesting kind of mix because it's wealthy, it's intellectual, it's innovative, it's traditional, it's all kind of mixed up. But in that mix, amongst the artists, there are some who actually had the opportunity to go to Europe and study directly there.
Some of these Western-trained painters thought the modernization of Chinese art could only take place by adopting classical European styles. Others looked to the rebellious post-impressionists for inspiration. As Shanghai grew into the 20th century, it reached what some say were commercial and cultural heights. The women of Shanghai, caught in the cross-currents between traditional and modern life, were depicted in colorful posters. And a booming film industry. Their clothing was stylish and distinctly Chinese. By the 1930s, Shanghai was at the forefront of design. Its posters and calendar art were striking. And Shanghai deco furniture was in demand. But there was a dark side. Poverty, excess, and corruption would fan the flames of revolution.
They're the arts of the revolution that were done in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And these are anti-establishment. These are the intellectuals in Shanghai saying, you know, the high times, what's going on here is not right. We need to be aware of the problems of all the people.
After the communist takeover in 1949, Chairman Mao Zedong used the arts to create images of working people and celebrate the revolution.
You get into the propaganda posters of the 50s and on, and that's establishment art. So there's a very different kind of sense, even though it's about revolution.
China opened once again to the West in the 1980s, and since then, Shanghai's artists have contributed to the country's explosive contemporary art scene.
And I think the artists there are still somewhat finding their footing. But I think much more in Shanghai than in some other areas. You begin to get a sense of local identity and personal identity and reflections of the past and the present.
Or, like the city itself, past and present merge to create something new, adding another layer of richness to Shanghai's unique culture. The Asian Art Museum's Shanghai exhibit continues through September 5th.
For links to other Shanghai-related events, performances, and exhibitions taking place throughout the year, go to our website at kqed.org/thisweek. Well, that's all for tonight. Join us for our one-hour broadcast next week with a look at old and new culinary traditions as we celebrate the Chinese New Year on Food and Wine This Week with Leslie Shabako. Also, the Fillmore Project, an original dance theater production celebrating the rich musical and cultural history of the Fillmore District. Visit our website at kqed.org/thisweek to watch complete episodes and segments, subscribe to the newsletter and podcast, and comment on the show. I'm Belva Davis. Good night.
Major funding for Spark on This Week in Northern California has been provided by the James Irvine Foundation, Diane B. Wilsey, and the KQED Campaign for the Future Program Venture Fund. Additional support has been provided by the following: